Hello, this video is to introduce the new Karma soft close device for Ferrari's Compacta-Line ET64 and ET88. One thing to point out on the actual ET64 hinges and ET88 hinges, no changes have been made on the functionality of these hinges. The only changes made have been made to accommodate the Karma's locking device. The Karma device itself, the only thing that's changed on that as well is, first off, the finish of the mechanism itself is now very similar, if not equal, to the finish of our hinges. Also, we've incorporated a child-proof tension adjustment screw. Now it's no longer able to be loosened with your fingertips. It must be done with a posi drive screwdriver. On the ET64 hinge, in order to apply the Karma soft close mechanism, very simple way of application. First off, point out there's a couple of teeth here underneath the ET64's type Karma. Those teeth act as a pivot point in order to engage it in place. Those teeth line up to the bottom end of the actual plate of the ET64. They pivot it down in place here and lays it flat on top of the plate. One thing to note on this is you know that it's been put in correctly when there's no gap underneath the plate. It lays completely flush. Once that's done, there's a series of dots on the actual mechanism here. One that's put on the screw, the other one that's on the actual mechanism. The way that this locks in place is simply by lining up those dots. Now you know that the mechanism is locked in place. On the ET88, similar but yet slightly different. Again, we have the teeth on this mechanism. There's only one tooth, and that's right here on the side there. That tooth right there, again, just like on the ET64, it lines it up, makes sure that it's in place on the ET88. What needs to be done is that tooth needs to slide underneath the groove of the hole on the ET88. And again, just make sure that when you've put it in place, in the front view, there's no gap underneath. It lays flat on top of the plate. Once again, to lock it, you just line up the dots, and you have a nice secure fit. One warning you might want to tell the customers is that in order to apply this screw, it must only be done with the posi drive screwdriver. Do not attempt to do this with a screw gun. You will strip out this screw. Also, another note, it's a very easy application like we've gone through, but there's 3 steps the customer should go through when they apply these hinges and the Karma mechanism into their cabinet. First step would be to apply the hinge itself into the cabinet, install it into the cabinet itself. Once that's done, the second step is to make the necessary adjustments that need to be made to this hinge in order to close the door correctly. And the last thing the customer should do is apply the Karma soft close device to the top of the hinge. Even though there are some adjustments that are still available once the Karma is in place, it works much better to make the adjustments before the Karma device is set in place. One thing you might want to also point out on the removal. The removal from the ET64 is very simple. You just, again, make sure that the dots are not lined up and then pivot it back on those teeth. On the ET88, however, is a little slightly more difficult, but if you know what you're doing, it's not that bad. Again, make sure that the dots are not lined up. Then you're going to pivot the mechanism itself towards the dampener and disengage that tooth. It's a very important part. Make sure that that's disengaged and you can pull it back apart again. Another thing that you might want to keep in consideration, the way that The way that this locking device works on this screw here, the dots on this, they always should be not lined up when the mechanism is off of the hinge. The only time you should make sure that those are locked in place and lined up is when it's put onto the hinge. And that's simply because if this is put in place like that, the screw itself will come out of the plate on the Karma. And that's because the locking device now lines up with the pivot point inside of the mechanism. If that does happen, however, it's very simple. Just line it back up again, stick it in place, and then once again turn it so that it's now in the unlocked position. Some highlights you might want to point out on this mechanism. First off is your secure fit with the teeth. It's always make sure that you're going to be pivoting in the correct position. With the secure fit. Now you have a tension adjustment screw in the back end here. That's another highlight. The child proofing, where this cannot be loosened by finger. Also, the dampener itself has a pivot point. A dimple that will not allow it to come out from the front. It has to be removed from the back end. And lastly, when applied correctly onto the hinge, the dampener itself strikes against the plate rather than strike against the door.